About 80 years after the crucifixion, a Roman historian named Tacitus sat down to document the reign of Emperor Nero. In passing, he wrote about a fire that had ravaged Rome and how Nero pinned the blame on an unpopular group known as the Christians. Tacitus didn't like them. He called their beliefs a pernicious superstition. But then he mentioned something that didn't come from myth or hearsay. According to Tacitus, the group's name came from Christus, who suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. It's a blink and you miss it sentence, but it's also huge. Tacitus wasn't a Christian. He had no reason to promote the faith. If anything, he despised it. And yet, here he was, confirming that there was a man called Christus who had been executed under a Roman governor. Then there's Josephus, a Jewish historian born just a few years after Jesus' reported death. In his massive history of the Jewish people, he mentioned a man named James and casually referred to him as the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. There is another passage in Josephus that talks about Jesus more directly. No legend, just a note in the margins. Most records from this era didn't survive at all. Scholars agree it was later edited or embellished by Christian scribes who wanted to clean it up for theology. But the more boring offhand references, those are harder to fake and harder to ignore. It's tempting to dismiss these ancient mentions as vague or unreliable. But it's important to remember what we're dealing with. The Romans didn't write biographies of minor provincial rebels, but men who had caused just enough of a stir to be remembered. A Roman punishment for a Roman crime, recorded by a Roman historian who had no stake in the story. His name started showing up in the weirdest places, in the most offhand ways. It might be the coldest, clearest fingerprint we have. And yet, two non-Christian sources from different backgrounds made a point to mention Jesus by name and by consequence. What makes this even more curious is how little Christian legend seems to have influenced these sources. Tacitus didn't describe miracles. He didn't talk about resurrection or divinity. Just execution. That's it. And Josephus? He was a Jew who tried to make sense of Roman rule, Jewish revolt, and his people's place in the world. If he mentioned Jesus and his brother James without flair or agenda, it tells us something else, that these weren't figures of myth. But there's another layer to this puzzle, because Jesus didn't make it into records alone. In 112 AD, a Roman official named Pliny the Younger had a strange problem on his hands. He was governor of a province in what is now Turkey, and he didn't know what to do with a growing number of people who refused to curse someone named Christ. Pliny wasn't writing a theological treatise. He was just trying to get legal advice. In a letter to Emperor Trajan, he explained that these people Christians were gathering at dawn, singing hymns to Christ as to a god, and swearing oaths to avoid theft, adultery, and lying. Pliny doesn't mention Jesus by name, but Christ was not a common term. Not rebellion, not sedition, just being annoyingly moral. Pliny wanted to know, should he punish them anyway? The letter is short, bureaucratic, and oddly specific, which, if true, would date their conversion to the late 1st century, within a few decades of the crucifixion itself. What's more interesting is that this was barely 80 years after Jesus' death. And here we already have non-Christian evidence of people worshiping him, not just talking about him. And no writings inspired this much chatter just one generation after his death. This Jewish rabbinic text isn't a fan of Jesus. In fact, it may have been written to mock him. Even strangers, how stubborn these people were. Pliny tried threatening them, giving them multiple chances to recant. But some refused, saying they had been Christians for more than 20 years. The date matches. The method hanged was also a common euphemism for crucifixion. Now, cross-reference that with another oddball document, the Babylonian Talmud. Well, that was how many Jewish leaders viewed the early Christian movement. It's the opposite. The rabbis behind it wanted to discredit Jesus, not promote him. Not as a myth or legend, as a real person who said things that got him into serious trouble. One passage refers to a man called Yeshu, who was hanged on the eve of Passover, accused of leading Israel astray and practicing sorcery. And the description of leading people astray? What makes the Talmudic reference significant isn't that it's flattering, but in doing so, they revealed that there was a memory of him. And then there's the big question: how did a man with no army, no political office, no wealth? That's where things get even more interesting, because if Jesus was just a made-up figure, his enemies never seem to get the memo. When someone doesn't exist, their enemies usually don't bother attacking them. But Jesus, he had enemies, plenty of them, and they had no trouble calling him all sorts of things, just not fictional. Early critics didn't say, "This man never lived." They said, "He's dangerous," or "He's a fraud," or "He's getting people to worship the wrong way." Even hostile sources, written close to the time he supposedly lived, treat him like an actual person, a strange one, maybe a deluded one. He wrote a full book attacking the faith, mocking its beliefs and its founder. He claimed Jesus was the illegitimate child of a Roman soldier. He once described Christians as worshiping a man who was crucified in Palestine and living by his laws. Again, no belief in the miracles, no sympathy for the followers, but no hint that the man himself was imaginary, but definitely real. Take Celsus, a 2nd century Greek philosopher who despised Christianity. That's not how people react to characters they don't think are real. They were too busy attacking what he said and what his followers believed. And why did they direct so much venom at his followers if the whole story was just a fabrication? Even the harshest voices in the early Roman world seem to have accepted that Jesus lived, preached, gathered followers, and was executed. But here's what he didn't say: that Jesus was a myth. They focused on whether he was a false teacher, a magician, or a blasphemer. The insults were specific, personal, grounded in the idea that there was someone there to insult. For all his mockery, Celsus took Jesus' existence for granted. He said Jesus learned magic in Egypt. He called his followers gullible and their morals hypocritical. Or Lucian of Samosata, a sarcastic writer from the same period. Even within Jewish tradition, debates about Jesus didn't hinge on whether he existed. Fair enough. But even in religious debates, people usually agree on who's real. The arguments are over meaning and truth, not existence. When real historical people are mythologized, like Alexander the Great, or even Julius Caesar, historians don't throw out the core facts. They strip away the legend to find the man underneath. Think about how myths are usually treated. No one writes angry tracts about Zeus. No Roman senator penned a furious screed against Romulus. So why did so many early critics aim their arrows at a carpenter-turned-preacher from Galilee? You could argue that people love to fight about religion. And here is the thing. No ancient critic of Christianity ever tried to strip away Jesus. This creates a strange kind of confirmation. Not through praise, but through insult. Not through stories, but through accusations. What they couldn't agree on was why it had all gotten so out of hand. And to get closer to that answer, we have to talk about someone else, Jesus himself. Or more accurately, his complete and total silence. For a man who sparked one of the most influential movements in human history, Jesus left behind nothing in his own handwriting. No letters, no diaries, no manifestos scribbled on parchment. Compared to philosophers like Plato or rulers like Augustus, Jesus is a ghost in the historical record. Everything we know about him comes from second-hand sources. That silence, his personal silence, has become one of the biggest arguments used by skeptics to suggest he might never have existed. But let's step back for a second. Jesus wasn't a scholar. He wasn't a Roman official. He wasn't part of the literate elite. He was, by all accounts, a rural preacher, and an oral culture. Most people in first century Galilee couldn't read, let alone write. Public teaching was done by speaking, debating, storytelling. Writing things down? That was for scribes, wealthy patrons, bureaucrats, the powerful. So in a strange way, Jesus not writing anything actually fits the profile of who he was supposed to be. And the fact that his teaching survived and all passed on by memory, retold over campfires, eventually written decades later, isn't so much a gap as it is a miracle of its own. But there was pushback, just not the kind skeptics expected. That all this noise, Paul's letters, oral traditions, early hymns, legal records built up around someone who never held a scroll. Still, there's another layer here that makes this even more puzzling. In Paul's letters, some of the earliest Christian writings we have are full of references to Jesus' life, his death, his followers, his family, his brother James, who Paul met. These aren't wild mythological tales. They're short, practical, sometimes rambling documents written to real communities dealing with real problems. Because within just a few years of his reported death, dozens of letters do appear. But they're not written by Jesus. They're written by Paul. Paul never met Jesus in person, but he claims to have had visions of him. And they were written at a time when plenty of people were still alive who could have said, "Wait, who?" But no one seems to have done that. What we don't see in Paul's letters, or anywhere else from that era, is a single opponent saying, "You're making this all up." Jesus never existed. Instead, debates revolved around who he was. Was he the Messiah? Was he divine? Was he just another failed prophet? If Jesus had been a made-up figure, invented whole cloth by later writers, the silence wouldn't have been in his pen. It would have been in the pushback. And maybe that's what makes this even more compelling. Which leads us to a twist most people don't expect. The idea that Jesus was a myth is actually a very modern myth. Here's what most people don't realize. The claim that Jesus never existed, that he was a total fabrication, didn't catch fire until the last 200 years. In the ancient world, even the harshest critics of Christianity didn't deny Jesus was real. That argument only gained traction during the Enlightenment, when scholars started peeling away the supernatural elements of the Bible and asking, what's left? If his followers believed in miracles and resurrection, maybe he was just an invention, a symbol, a stitched-together hero borrowed from earlier myths. As historical methods improved, some went even further, suggesting Jesus never existed at all. If the stories about him were written decades later, this idea is sometimes called mythicism, and on the surface, it's tempting. If Jesus didn't write anything. But here's the problem. Mythic figures don't usually inspire sudden, fast-moving, world-altering movements, especially not in hostile territory. And they don't get named by Roman governors, or mocked by Jewish rabbis, or discussed in court letters to emperors. So, humiliatingly executed, but as a real man who was remembered by both his friends and his enemies. A man who preached, provoked, and paid for it. The legend came later, but the impact? That started with someone real. The Jesus movement didn't evolve slowly over centuries like most myths. Not a biography, not a gospel, but a historical shadow cast by a man who, against all odds, was too significant to erase. What's left isn't a myth made from thin air. It's a faint but stubborn thread of history that refuses to snap. None of those gods had brothers named James. None were executed by Roman authorities. But real lives leave splinters. They provoke letters, rumors, accusations. They create problems for governors, headaches for historians, and movements that sometimes don't die with the man. Within 20 years of his death, you had people worshiping him across multiple provinces. None were tied so tightly to a specific time, place, and culture. We may never have his handwriting, or a lock of his hair, or a photo etched in stone. The question is who he was and why. 2,000 years later, we're still asking, but we have echoes. And in ancient history, sometimes echoes are enough. But the memory stuck. You had people dying for him. You had his brother running a community in Jerusalem. That's not the footprint of a legend cooked up in someone's imagination. Creating a Messiah who gets publicly tortured to death would have been the worst possible PR campaign. Unless it actually happened. Unless his followers were trying to explain an event they didn't expect. Something they had to make sense of after the fact. And while mythicists love to point out similarities between Jesus and older pagan gods of Cyrus, Mithras, Dionysus, those comparisons usually fall apart under scrutiny. The man at the center of it all probably walked, spoke, and died in the dust of Roman Judea. There's also the question of motive. If early Christians were going to invent a savior, why make him so human? So vulnerable? In the ancient world, crucifixion wasn't just death, it was shame. And that's where the historical Jesus starts to take shape. Not as a myth, not as a god in disguise. When we step back, filter out the noise, and let the record speak through Roman sneers, Jewish sarcasm, early letters, and silent gaps, we're left with something strangely solid. And whether or not you believe in the stories that followed. So, was there a historical Jesus? Strip away the miracles, the sermons, the resurrection. Strip away the stained glass windows and centuries of theology. Roman officials, Jewish historians, pagan critics, they weren't fans, but they remembered him. Maybe only in passing, maybe only to dismiss him. That's the strange power of real people. Myths can be molded. We may never know everything about the man behind the name. The question isn't whether Jesus of Nazareth existed. The question is who he was and why, 2,000 years later, we're still asking.